they've got a swarm of drones they need to control and a whole bunch of electronic warfare suites on board, well, you can expect that governments are going to want the larger aircraft, but to reduce its signature and vulnerability even over current next-generation fighters. And if we talk about what the United States Air Force wants, well, we'll get to that one at the end. Plus, some of the programs call for either or both significantly increased range, so congratulations, find a bunch of space for internal fuel storage, and a significant weapons load, all stored in internal bays so as not to ruin the stealth profile of the aircraft. So again, engineers, in amongst the electricity generation, power storage, coolant system, and next generation electronics, can you please find a whole bunch of room in a stealth shape for a whole bunch of fuel and next generation engine and a whole bunch of next generation weapon systems? Easy. And all of this, as I said, is pointing squarely towards aircraft that are mind-numbingly expensive in terms of both design, manufacture, and sustainment. The need to pack the system with a dizzying array of weapons and sensors points to a larger aircraft. The need for excessive power generation points to at least a twin-engine design, and thus a larger aircraft. The desire to team the next-generation fighter with a bunch of unmanned vehicles that it will be commanding and controlling calls for at least, I believe, a two-person layout. I was consulting with an American F-16 pilot in the lead-up to this episode who put it relatively well. He essentially said that single-seat fighter pilots take great pride in their ability to multitask, but if you're talking about commanding offside drones, well, that calls for at least, at the very minimum, a second seat, so the pilot can continue to fly the aircraft. So we're not talking about a new generation of F-35s here. We're talking about monsters, twin-engine heavy fighters with the absolute best of everything, including a suite of next-generation technologies. And if you think that's going to come cheap, you're dreaming. If you want to talk about the fighter at the core of the United States Air Force 6th generation program, the so-called penetrating counter-air, which we'll talk about a little later on, they've already said that aircraft is likely to cost hundreds of millions of dollars per unit, bearing in mind that they've managed to get the cost of new-build F-35As down to about $80 million. And from a procurement perspective, the vicious cycle doesn't end there. Because the aircraft both costs more and is likely to be required in more limited numbers because it's supported by offside drone systems, fewer of them are likely to be built, all else being equal, by any given buyer. The American taxpayer probably isn't going to want to foot the bill for replacing every single F-15 and F-22 in service with a replacement aircraft that costs hundreds of millions per. Now that sounds like a good way to save money, but from an industrial perspective, not being able to manufacture a system at scale makes everything more expensive. You don't get those same economies of scale. You don't get a long-run production line where workers become better at their jobs and the production line techniques improve over time. You don't get a long tail for spare parts. You don't get multiple users in a large fleet being able to exchange lessons, spare parts, and supplies and develop economies over time. No, expensive development programs and small order numbers are how you got the $2 billion B-2 Spirit and the extensive maintenance costs that went with it. So the question becomes, how on earth do you make this work? And to be fair, rather than just set the entire US Treasury or the British Exchequer on fire, there are a couple of solutions that have been attempted. The first solutions are what most people would regard as the boring ones, but hey, I find this bit interesting, so it goes first. And that is that we're just getting better at designing aircraft, or rather, we're getting better at the design process. The mantra here often quoted is not to build better systems, although that is certainly a goal, but it is to build systems better. And here there definitely could be an entire video on the topic. All you've seen in recent developments, the B-21 is probably a poster child of this new approach. If you've got a combination of a better deployment of digital tools, and involvement of a sort of a rapid capabilities office in the United States Air Force that looks at getting programs into service sooner, and an approach wherein you try and digitally model just about everything before you move on to the project. Northrop Grumman called this the MDX approach, model-based everything. And it's one of the reasons that the B-21 Raider came in ahead of time and under budget, which is basically unheard of for a major aircraft procurement program. And the list of de-risking techniques and improvements goes on. If you look at how software is now developed for the modern aircraft, it follows what is essentially, you could almost call it like an agile methodology analog in a software development sense, wherein instead of trying to develop a piece of software in one go and then socializing it, you instead incrementally improve a bit of software, getting feedback from stakeholders at every stage of the process. Now that's more resource intensive because you're consulting more, you're involving more people, you're deploying more manpower, and you're not jumping straight to the finished product you might with a more traditional software development method. But you can identify issues early, you get feedback early, and the risk of the whole thing getting to the end of the process and being a complete dud is much reduced. If there's a critical flaw in the system, you're going to discover it early, and if it's introduced in a particular sprint or iteration, well, that's okay. You roll back and you try something different. There are even innovations in the way contracts are designed, but I imagine even my audience draws the line hearing about the benefits of splitting design, production, and sustainment contracts, so let's move on. The second solution, as we've already discussed, is actually one of the core features of the 6th generation fighter, which is to reduce fleet size. Why do you reduce fleet size? Because you now have legions of unmanned platforms operating alongside the manned platform. And if each manned system is actually now just the command center, the nerve center, the core, the controller of a network of unmanned systems, well, you don't need huge swarms of manned aircraft in order to win a fight. We'll talk about the United States Navy's program in a bit, but the key point there is that they're planning on steadily increasing the number of unmanned versus manned platforms on a carrier group. So even if the 6th gen fighter is massively more expensive than the aircraft it's replacing, if you don't need to do a one-to-one replacement, then maybe you can stretch the budget to accommodate the upgrade. You do, however, get the issue, as I said, of production scale. If you're not buying as many, they're going to be more expensive. So how do you solve that particular problem? How do you still get scale while having a very small production run? The answer, of course, is that for most nations, there's only one solution to the combination of huge costs, engineering challenges, and the need to get production scale. If you're not the United States or the People's Republic of China, you probably can't afford to run your own 6th generation program. You need to do them collectively, as part of a mega project that spans multiple nations. And indeed, two of the major 6th generation fighter projects we're about to talk about are multinational in nature, GCAP and FCAS. By doing that, not only can you bring contractors from other countries in onto your program to make sure you have access to the engineering talent and the technology necessary to deliver, but you've also got baked in another customer for the final aircraft. Even if Britain only wants to buy a relatively small number of the Tempest, if it's also sure that Italy and Japan will buy the aircraft as well, then maybe it's still worth setting up a factory with a significant size and getting some scale production going. Now, if you're the Americans or the Chinese, you can just buy a lot of your own aircraft anyway, no matter how expensive they get. And I'm not going to talk about the Russian project today. I am rather pessimistic generally on the topic of 6th generation fighters coming out of Russia. They may have the history, they may have the technical talent, but I'm nervous about the budget and the scale they would need in order to do so on a good timeline in any sort of reasonable quantity. And I'm not sure if any of you have been paying attention to the news, but right now there aren't many countries lining up at the front gate to sign up with Russia on major defense cooperation agreements. India has been greatly disappointed before by things like the PAC-FAR project. The Chinese are clearly going their own way, and somehow I can't imagine any European states signing up to do cooperative weapon dev with Russia. So to skip Russia and to leave the generalities behind, let's have a look at some of the critical programs, some of the major efforts that we know are developing 6th generation aircraft. And with a warning that from this point out we're basically in the land of speculation and press releases, let's have a look at the first example, the Global Combat Air Program, a meeting of East v West, a multinational program that brings together the British, the Italians, and the Japanese. And GCAP gets to go first, not just because it has an interesting backstory, but because I think in terms of the program's objectives, it's the most grounded. And we'll get increasingly, shall we say, science fiction as we go through the list. Now, when I first started preparing for this topic many months ago, GCAP didn't exist. Back then, there was only Tempest, which is the manned component of the, at the time, British-Italian program. Given it was the Brits and the Italians together, the primary contracting partners write themselves. BAE Systems is the prime contractor. Leonardo over in Italy would handle the sensors, the electronics, and the avionics. Rolls-Royce would build the engines because who else would have built the engines? And MBDA UK would handle the integration. So far, so good. BAE promised a variety of innovations in the Tempest, and there have been some scale models and concepts released. I'll include ARM scale models and concepts throughout this presentation.